When my mother turned 49 last autumn, something shifted in our family home that sent chills down my spine. I watched as my grandmother Eleanor immediately began rearranging the third floor of our sprawling Connecticut estate, transforming what had been a sunny guest suite into something she called the transition room. The way she moved with such practiced efficiency, as if she had done this countless times before, made my stomach turn. And she had done it before more times than I could count on both hands. "Your mother needs peace and serenity for her final year," Eleanor announced one evening as we stood in the doorway of the newly arranged room. Her voice carried that same gentle tone she used when speaking to small children or frightened animals, but there was something underneath it that I had never noticed before. She gestured to the wall of photographs she had carefully arranged, each frame perfectly aligned with the others. Every single face staring back at us belonged to a family member who had passed away at exactly 50 years old. Not 49, not 51, but precisely on their 50th birthday. The pattern was so exact, it defied any logical explanation. Growing up in the Morrison family meant accepting certain truths without question. The sun rises in the east, water freezes at 32 degrees, and Morrisons die at 50. It was spoken about with the same casual certainty as discussing the weather or what to have for dinner. I remember being 8 years old and watching my Uncle Thomas celebrate his 49th birthday with tears streaming down his face, not from joy, but from the knowledge that he had exactly 365 days left to live. The adults had tried to shield us children from the harsh reality, but kids notice everything, especially when the grown-ups think they are not paying attention. The farewell letters were perhaps the most haunting part of our family tradition. Each person who approached their 50th birthday would spend their final weeks writing letters to their loved ones, carefully crafted messages meant to provide comfort after they were gone. These letters were stored in my grandmother's study, filed away in leather-bound boxes labelled with names and dates. Sometimes I would catch her in there running her fingers over the spines of these boxes like a librarian checking inventory. She kept them organised by year, and the collection went back 4 generations, each box containing the final words of someone who knew exactly when they would die. Everyone called it the Morrison curse, speaking in hushed tones about genetics and hereditary conditions that somehow caused our bodies to shut down at exactly 50 years. Doctors had been consulted over the decades, specialists brought in from prestigious hospitals, genetic tests run and rerun, but no one could find any medical explanation for the pattern. It simply was what it was. An accepted fact of Morrison life that we would live vibrant, full lives until our 50th birthday when we would go to sleep and never wake up. The consistency of it was both terrifying and oddly comforting in its predictability. My grandmother Eleanor was the exception that proved the rule, or so everyone said. At 78 years old, she was the only Morrison in living memory to survive past 50. When asked about it, she would get this distant look in her eyes and shake her head slowly, as if she herself could not understand why death had passed her by. "Maybe I was spared so I could guide the rest of you through the transition," she would say, and everyone would nod as if this made perfect sense. She had become our family's death doula, the one who helped each person prepare for their inevitable end, who sat with them in their final days and held their hands as they slipped away. This time was different, though, because this time it was my mother. Sarah Morrison, 49 years old, successful architect, devoted mother, and according to family tradition, living her last year on Earth. When Eleanor moved her into the transition room, something inside me rebelled against accepting this fate. I had watched aunts and uncles and cousins make this journey, but I could not stand by and watch it happen to my mother without fighting back somehow. The problem was that I had no idea what I was fighting against. How do you battle a curse that has no medical explanation, no logical cause, just a statistical impossibility that had become a family certainty? The transition room itself was beautiful in a deeply unsettling way. Eleanor had decorated it with soft colours and comfortable furniture, fresh flowers delivered daily, and large windows that looked out over the estate gardens. She installed a small refrigerator stocked with herbal teas and health drinks, a library of spiritual and philosophical books about death and dying, and a writing desk where my mother could work on her farewell letters. Everything about the room was designed to create a peaceful environment for someone's final year, but to me it felt like a beautifully appointed prison cell. My mother grabbed my hand as Eleanor left us alone in the room for the first time, her grip so tight it actually hurt. "I am not ready," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I want to see you get married, meet my grandchildren, grow old disgracefully. I want more time." The fear in her eyes broke something inside me. This was not the peaceful acceptance that Eleanor always described. This was terror, raw and primal, the fear of someone who desperately wanted to live but believed they had no choice in the matter. I tried to offer hope where I had none to give. "Maybe you will be like Eleanor," I suggested, forcing optimism into my voice. "Maybe you will be the second one to break the pattern." My mother's laugh was bitter and short. "Nobody else has ever lived past 50 except Aunt Margaret," she reminded me. And look what happened to her. The mere mention of Margaret's name sent a familiar chill through the room. Great Aunt Margaret had somehow made it to 51, and for a brief, shining moment, everyone thought she had broken the curse. But then her daughter Jennifer died suddenly 2 days later, and Margaret followed the day after that. Eleanor always said the curse had claimed them both because Margaret had cheated death and disrupted the natural order. It was a warning to anyone who might think about trying to fight their fate. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom and opened my laptop, determined to understand our family curse through research and logic rather than superstition and fear. I started with genealogy websites, tracing our family tree back as far as digital records would allow. What I found confused me even more. Prior to Eleanor's generation, I could not find any pattern of early deaths in our family. Her parents, my great-grandparents, had both lived into their 70s. Their parents had lived even longer. The curse, it seemed, had begun with Eleanor's generation, starting with her husband Robert, who had died on his 50th birthday, shortly after Eleanor inherited the family estate from her father. I made spreadsheets and charts tracking every death I could verify. The pattern was undeniable but also impossible. 23 family members had died at exactly 50 years old over the past 4 decades. Not approximately 50, not in their 50th year, but precisely on their birthdays. The statistical probability of this happening naturally was so astronomical that my calculator could not even display the number. It was like flipping a coin and getting heads 1,000 times in a row. Possible in theory, but so unlikely that any reasonable person would suspect the coin was rigged. My mother settled into the transition room with a resignation that broke my heart. Each day she grew a little paler, a little more tired, as if the room itself was draining her life force. Eleanor visited multiple times daily, bringing special herbal teas and health drinks that she said would ease the transition. She spoke in soothing tones about acceptance and letting go, about the peace that comes with surrendering to fate. I watched my vibrant, energetic mother transform into someone I barely recognized, someone who spoke about her own death as if it were as inevitable as tomorrow's sunrise. The herbal drinks Eleanor prepared became a daily ritual. She would arrive each morning with a fresh batch, pale brown liquid in delicate china cups that smelled of chamomile, and something else I could not identify. My mother would drink them obediently, and within an hour she would be drowsy and confused, spending most of the day sleeping or staring vacantly out the window. Eleanor said this was normal, that the body naturally began to shut down as it approached its predetermined end date. The medical term for it was terminal lucidity, she explained, the phenomenon where dying people experience periods of clarity before the end. I started spending more time at the house, ostensibly to support my mother, but really to observe and document everything happening. I took photos of the herbal drinks when Eleanor was not looking, made notes about my mother's symptoms and their timing. The more I watched, the more wrong everything felt. My mother's decline seemed too orchestrated, too perfectly timed to Eleanor's visits and treatments. But whenever I tried to voice my concerns, Eleanor would give me that patient, understanding look and remind me that denial was a natural part of the grieving process. One evening, while Eleanor was downstairs preparing dinner, I decided to search her study. The room was like stepping back in time, with dark wood panelling and leather-bound books covering every wall. The boxes of farewell letters were arranged on custom-built shelves, each one labelled with a brass nameplate. I pulled down the box marked with Uncle Thomas's name and opened it carefully. Inside were several letters in his handwriting, but something felt off about them. The language was stilted and formal, not at all how Thomas actually spoke. Every letter contained nearly identical phrases about accepting fate and thanking Eleanor for her comfort and guidance. I photographed the letters quickly, then moved on to other boxes. The pattern repeated itself with eerie consistency. Different handwriting, but the same phrases, the same gratitude to Eleanor, the same peaceful acceptance of death. Most disturbing were the mentions of drowsiness and confusion in the days leading up to their deaths, symptoms they all attributed to their bodies naturally shutting down. I was so absorbed in my investigation that I almost did not hear Eleanor's footsteps on the stairs. I managed to replace the boxes and sit down at the desk just as she opened the door. "Finding you in here brings back memories," she said, her voice neutral but her eyes sharp. "Your mother used to love this room when she was young, always so curious about family history." I forced myself to remain calm, to match her conversational tone. "I was just looking for a book to read to Mom," I lied. "Something comforting." Eleanor's gaze swept across the room as if checking that everything was in its proper place. She recommended a book of poetry from a lower shelf, her movements deliberate as she handed it to me. She stood between me and the farewell letterboxes as she walked me to the door, a subtle but clear message that my investigation was not welcome. That night, I called my cousin David, who lived in Seattle, one of the few family members, who had married late and was still in his 30s. I asked him what he remembered about his mother's death 10 years ago. There was a long pause before he answered. "Mum got really sick about a month before her birthday," he said slowly. "Tired all the time, confused, not herself. Eleanor took such good care of her, moved her into that special room, gave her those teas." His voice cracked as he continued. "The doctors said it was natural, that some people just know when their time is coming, but Mum was terrified right up until the end. She kept saying she wasn't ready. The conversation with David convinced me that something was terribly wrong with our family curse. I spent the next day researching deaths that looked natural but were actually murders. There were countless methods someone could use to slowly poison another person. Substances that would build up in the system over time and eventually cause organ failure that looked like natural death. Without specific testing for these substances, they would never be detected in a standard autopsy. But why would anyone test for poison when everyone expected the person to die anyway? I confronted Eleanor the next morning, catching her alone in the kitchen preparing my mother's herbal drink. "What exactly is in that tea?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me with those calm, patient eyes that had watched so many family members die. "It's a blend of herbs to ease transition," she said. "Chamomile for calm, valerian for sleep, and several traditional herbs that have been used for centuries to help the dying." The way she spoke about my mother as if she were already dying made my skin crawl. "My mother is not dying," I said firmly. "She's only 49. Eleanor's smile was sad and knowing. "Denial is natural, dear," she said, "but it only makes things harder for everyone." That afternoon, I sat with my mother and tried to get her to see what I was beginning to understand. The drowsiness, the confusion, the resignation, none of it was natural. But she was so deep under the influence of whatever Eleanor had been giving her that she could barely focus on my words. She kept drifting off mid-sentence, her eyes glazing over as if she were looking at something very far away. When I suggested we leave, go to a hospital, get real medical help, she became agitated and fearful. "The curse will follow me," she insisted. "Look what happened to Margaret. Her daughter died because Margaret tried to cheat fate. I cannot risk that happening to you." I left the estate that evening feeling more frustrated and frightened than ever. My mother was being systematically poisoned, I was sure of it, but I had no proof and no one who would believe me. The family curse was so ingrained in everyone's minds that suggesting murder was like suggesting the sun would not rise tomorrow. It was unthinkable, impossible, a sign that I was in denial about my mother's inevitable fate. But I knew what I had seen in those farewell letters, the identical phrases that suggested they had been dictated rather than written from the heart. And I knew what I was seeing in my mother's declining condition. I decided to track down our family members who had survived, the spouses and children who had watched their loved ones die at 50. Most were reluctant to talk about it, the memories too painful even years later. But slowly patterns emerged. Everyone mentioned the special room, the herbal drinks, Eleanor's constant presence. Several mentioned that their loved ones had seemed fearful and tried to resist at first, but eventually became too weak and confused to fight. One cousin's widow told me something that made my blood run cold. She said her husband had hidden money and made plans to run away right before his 50th birthday. But Eleanor found out and convinced him it would only bring the curse down on his children. The more people I talked to, the more I realized that fear was Eleanor's greatest weapon. The story of Margaret and her daughter had become family gospel, proof that trying to escape the curse would only bring death to the people you loved most. It kept everyone compliant, made them drink Eleanor's teas and write their farewell letters and accept their fate without question. But what if Margaret and her daughter had not died because of some supernatural curse? What if they had been murdered because Margaret had lived long enough to become suspicious and her daughter had started asking too many questions? I spent hours online researching Eleanor's past, looking for something that might explain how our family curse had really begun. What I found was a series of insurance policies, all of them naming Eleanor as the beneficiary. Every family member who had died at 50 had substantial life insurance, and Eleanor had collected on every single policy. Over the decades, she had accumulated millions of dollars, all of it appearing completely legitimate because everyone expected these deaths. Who would question insurance payouts for deaths that everyone knew were coming? The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. While searching through old news archives, I found a small article about Robert Morrison, Eleanor's husband and the first victim of the curse. The article mentioned that he had been planning to divorce Eleanor and had recently removed her from his will. He died 2 weeks later on his 50th birthday, and Eleanor inherited everything as his legal widow. The timing was too convenient, the motive too clear. Eleanor had killed her husband for money and then spent the next 40 years murdering family members to maintain the lie and keep the insurance money flowing. I knew I needed help, but who would believe such an incredible story? I decided to start with hard evidence, something that could be tested and verified. I managed to pocket a sample of the herbal drink Eleanor gave my mother, hiding it in a small container in my purse. I also took photos of all the medication bottles in the transition room, noting that none of them had proper prescription labels. Everything was in unmarked bottles or containers with handwritten labels, nothing that could be traced to a legitimate pharmacy or doctor. I found a private laboratory that would test the herbal drink without requiring a police report. While waiting for results, I installed a hidden camera in my mother's room, disguising it as a phone charger. I needed video evidence of Eleanor administering whatever she was giving my mother. The camera was connected to my phone, allowing me to monitor the room remotely. What I captured over the next few days was deeply disturbing. Eleanor visited at precise times, always bringing drinks or medications. After each visit, my mother's condition visibly deteriorated. Her speech became more slurred, her movements more sluggish, her periods of unconsciousness longer. The laboratory results confirmed my worst suspicions. The herbal drink contained a cocktail of sedatives and other drugs that, in combination, would cause progressive organ failure over time. The toxicologist explained that the specific combination was designed to mimic natural death, causing drowsiness and confusion before eventually stopping respiratory function. It was a sophisticated poison that required knowledge of pharmacology to create, and it would be virtually undetectable in a standard autopsy because the individual components were all legal substances that could be explained away as natural remedies or comfort medications. Armed with this evidence, I went to the police. The detective who listened to my story was skeptical at first, but the laboratory results and video footage got his attention. He agreed to open an investigation, but warned me that proving murders that had happened years or even decades ago would be nearly impossible. Our best chance was to prevent my mother's death and catch Eleanor in the act. He gave me his direct number and told me to call immediately if Eleanor prepared to give my mother any kind of final dose as her 50th birthday approached. I also managed to track down one family member who had escaped the curse through sheer luck. My mother's sister Grace had moved to Portland for work when she was 48 and had been too busy to return home much during her 49th year. She had started feeling sick about a month before her 50th birthday, experiencing the same drowsiness and confusion that plagued other family members. But the symptoms went away as soon as she stopped visiting the estate and drinking Eleanor's special teas. Now 58 years old and living under a different name, Grace confirmed everything I had suspected. She had tried to warn others, but no one believed her. And after Margaret and Jennifer died, she decided staying away was safer than fighting. Grace sent me her medical records from that time, showing how her liver function and cognitive scores improved dramatically once she left Eleanor's influence. Her doctor had noted that her symptoms were consistent with chronic low-level poisoning, but could not identify the source. It was the proof I needed that the curse was not genetic, but chemical, not supernatural, but murder. Grace agreed to return to help me save my mother, booking a flight that would arrive just before my mother's birthday. Meanwhile, I had to maintain the pretense of normalcy to avoid alerting Eleanor to my investigation. I continued visiting my mother daily, watching her grow weaker while pretending to accept her fate. Eleanor seemed pleased by my apparent resignation, even complimenting me on handling the situation with maturity and grace. She started preparing me to take over the family traditions, showing me where she kept important documents and explaining how to help future family members through their transitions. The casual way she discussed facilitating murders as if it were a noble calling made me physically ill. 3 days before my mother's 50th birthday, Eleanor announced she was preparing a special final comfort dose to help my mother sleep peacefully through her last day. The mention of it so casually, as if she were discussing what to serve for dinner, filled me with rage and terror in equal measure. I excused myself and immediately called Detective Ridley from my car. He told me to watch for when Eleanor actually prepared to administer this final dose and to call 911 immediately when it happened. Paramedics arriving on scene would create official documentation of my mother's condition and any substances found. I also called Grace to finalize our plan. She would wait nearby in a rental car while I monitored the situation from inside the house. The moment Eleanor made her move, I would call for help while Grace entered through a back entrance she still had keys for from decades ago. It was risky and required perfect timing, but it was our only chance to save my mother and expose Eleanor's crimes. We went over the plan again and again, trying to account for every possibility. The night before my mother's birthday, I positioned myself in a sitting room where I could watch the camera feed from my phone. Hours passed with nothing happening, just my mother sleeping and Eleanor checking on her periodically. Then, at exactly 9 o'clock, I saw Eleanor enter the room carrying a tray with a syringe. My hands shook as I dialed 911, reporting an attempted poisoning and giving our exact location. I ran up the stairs while still on the phone with the dispatcher, bursting into the room just as Eleanor was reaching for my mother's IV line. The look on Eleanor's face when she saw me was something I will never forget. Shock transformed into cold calculation as she realized what was happening. She tried to maintain her composure, insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that she was simply administering comfort care that my mother had consented to. But the syringe in her hand and my mother's barely conscious state told a different story. Grace appeared in the doorway moments later, having run from her car, and Eleanor's facade finally cracked. She backed toward the door, still clutching the syringe, her eyes darting between us like a trapped animal. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their quick response creating the official record we desperately needed. They assessed my mother's condition, noting her altered mental state and the concerning medication history. The hospital toxicology report would later confirm multiple sedatives in my mother's system at levels far exceeding any legitimate medical purpose. Eleanor was questioned by police that night, but not immediately arrested, as Detective Ridley wanted to build an airtight case with all the evidence properly documented. My mother spent her 50th birthday in a hospital bed, confused and weak, but alive. The drugs took time to clear from her system, but each day brought small improvements. The restraining order I filed was granted, legally barring Eleanor from any contact with my mother. Adult Protective Services finally opened an investigation, and the prosecutor began building cases for multiple murders based on the pattern of deaths and financial benefits Eleanor had received. Eleanor made bail using money from the estate she had built on the backs of her victims. She hired an expensive legal team and tried to paint me as a delusional granddaughter who could not accept my mother's natural death. But the evidence was overwhelming. The laboratory results, the video footage, the decades of insurance payouts, the matching symptoms across all the victims. One by one, family members began to speak up, sharing their suspicions and experiences. The story made local news, though the full horror of it was hard for people to comprehend. My mother's recovery was slow but steady. We found a small rental house with good security, far from the estate that had been a death trap disguised as a family home. She struggled with the psychological impact of accepting that her own mother had planned to murder her for money, that the woman who had raised her had also killed her father and so many others. Therapy helped, as did the support of family members who finally understood the truth about our supposed curse. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Eleanor's lawyers fought every charge, but the prosecutor had built a strong case. The investigation revealed that Eleanor had accumulated nearly $4 million over the decades through insurance payouts from family deaths. She had murdered 23 people, including her own husband, children, siblings, and grandchildren, all while playing the role of the caring matriarch who helped her family through their final transitions. During the investigation, more evidence emerged. Eleanor had books on poisons and natural toxins with specific passages highlighted. She had notebooks detailing dosages and symptoms for each victim, written in code but decipherable with effort. The farewell letters all showed signs of coercion, with handwriting analysis revealing that many were written under the influence of drugs that impaired cognitive function. Margaret and her daughter Jennifer had indeed been murdered when they threatened to expose the truth, their deaths staged to reinforce the curse narrative and keep others in line through fear. The trial became a sensation, the story of a grandmother who killed her own family for money, capturing national attention. Eleanor maintained her innocence throughout, insisting she had only helped her family through their natural deaths. But the evidence was undeniable. She was eventually convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At her sentencing, she showed no remorse, only cold fury at being caught after decades of successful deception. The aftermath of Eleanor's conviction brought both relief and grief to our family. Those who had lost loved ones struggled with the knowledge that their deaths could have been prevented if someone had questioned the curse sooner. Survivor's guilt plagued those of us who had escaped, especially my mother, who wondered why she had been saved when so many others had not. We held a memorial service for all of Eleanor's victims, finally able to grieve properly for deaths that had been stolen from us under the guise of inevitability. My mother lived to see her 51st birthday, then her 52nd, each year a victory over the lie that had claimed so many. She returned to her work as an architect, designing buildings that would stand long after she was gone, a defiance of the premature death that had nearly claimed her. The transition room in the old estate was demolished during the investigation, the walls yielding more evidence of Eleanor's crimes. The estate itself was eventually sold, the proceeds distributed among the survivors and the families of victims. The Morrison family curse died with Eleanor's conviction, revealed not as a genetic fate, but as the delusion of a greedy woman who valued money over the lives of her own family. We still gather for holidays and celebrations, but now we celebrate life instead of accepting death. My mother, now approaching 60, sometimes jokes that she is living on borrowed time, but her laughter is genuine and free from fear. She has seen me marry and welcomed grandchildren she never thought she would meet, each milestone a gift that Eleanor tried to steal. I sometimes think about the 23 family members who died believing they were cursed, who spent their final days drugged and confused, writing farewell letters under Eleanor's guidance. They deserved better than to be victims of a fabricated fate. Their deaths were not inevitable or natural, but murders disguised as family tragedy. The real curse was not in our genes, but in the trust we placed in someone who saw us only as sources of income, who could watch her own children die for money and feel nothing but satisfaction at a plan well executed. The story of our family serves as a warning about the danger of accepted truths that go unquestioned. How many other families have their own versions of curses or patterns that everyone accepts without investigation? How many deaths are dismissed as natural or expected when they might be something far more sinister? I learned that love and trust within a family can be weaponized by someone willing to exploit those bonds for personal gain. Eleanor used our faith in family, our acceptance of tradition, and our fear of challenging authority to murder with impunity for 40 years. Grace moved back from Portland after the trial, no longer needing to hide from a woman who could not hurt her anymore. She and my mother rebuilt their relationship, sharing memories of siblings and cousins lost to Eleanor's greed. They started a foundation in memory of the victims, raising awareness about elder abuse and the importance of questioning unusual death patterns. The foundation offers resources for families dealing with suspicious circumstances around deaths, helping them find the courage to investigate even when everyone insists they are being paranoid or disrespectful. I returned to my own life but remained vigilant, the experience having taught me to question authority and investigate anomalies. My mother and I spoke daily, each conversation a reminder that she was still here, despite Eleanor's best efforts. The GPS tracker I had sewn into her clothes became a running joke between us, a symbol of the extremes I had gone to in order to save her. She kept it active for the first year, understanding my need to know she was safe after coming so close to losing her. The small rental house became a real home, filled with life and laughter that the transition room had tried to steal. My mother planted a garden, each flower a defiance of the death Eleanor had planned for her. She cooked elaborate meals, savouring flavours that the sedatives had dulled. She travelled to places she had never expected to see, sending postcards from cities she should never have visited. Every experience was sweeter for having been nearly lost, every day a gift that vigilance and investigation had secured. Looking back, I realised that the hardest part was not gathering evidence or convincing authorities, but overcoming the psychological hold Eleanor had on our family. The curse was a fiction, but its power was real because we all believed in it. Eleanor had created a narrative so compelling that we participated in our own destruction, drinking her poisons and writing her letters and accepting death as inevitable. Breaking free required not just detective work, but the courage to challenge a lifetime of conditioning and the willingness to be seen as crazy or disrespectful for questioning family tradition. My mother recently celebrated her 60th birthday with a party that would have been impossible under Eleanor's reign. Family members who had been estranged, too afraid to get close only to lose someone at 50, reunited and rebuilt relationships. Children who had grown up fearing their genetic fate learned to plan for futures beyond 50. The shadow that had hung over our family for decades finally lifted, replaced by hope and the normal uncertainty of not knowing when death will come. That uncertainty, once terrifying in its absence, became a gift that allowed us to truly live. The investigation revealed that Eleanor had begun planning her scheme even before marrying my grandfather. She had studied pharmacology and toxicology in her youth, knowledge she later claimed was just intellectual curiosity. She had chosen my grandfather specifically because his family had wealth and a history of dying young from various causes, making it easier to establish a pattern that would seem natural. Every death had been meticulously planned, from the selection of victims based on their insurance value to the timing that reinforced the curse narrative. It was a lifetime of calculated murder hidden behind a mask of loving care. I still have the evidence I gathered, stored safely in case it is ever needed again. The videos of Eleanor poisoning my mother, the laboratory results confirming the drugs, the photographs of the farewell letters with their forced language of acceptance. They serve as a reminder that evil can hide behind familiar faces and that family bonds can be exploited by those who should protect us. But they also remind me of my own strength, of the power of refusing to accept comfortable lies, and of the importance of fighting for truth even when everyone insists you are wrong. My mother's survival broke the Morrison family curse in the most literal way possible. She lived when she should have died, proving that our fate was never written in our genes but in Eleanor's notebooks. Every year she lives is a testament to the power of questioning authority and investigating anomalies. The family members we lost cannot be brought back, but their deaths were not in vain if their story prevents others from falling victim to similar schemes. The curse that killed 23 people died with Eleanor's conviction, and our family is finally free. Sometimes I dream about the transition room, that beautifully appointed space where so many family members spent their final days. In my dreams, the walls are transparent, and I can see Eleanor moving through the house like a spider, spinning her web of lies and poison. But then I wake up in a world where my mother is alive, where the curse is broken, and where truth triumphed over tradition. It is a world that almost was not, saved by suspicion and stubbornness and the refusal to accept that some things are inevitable. The Morrison family curse was never real, but the love that drove me to investigate it was. And that love saved my mother's life. The story does not end with Eleanor's conviction or my mother's survival. It continues every day that former victims live beyond 50, every grandchild born to parents who should have died, every family gathering unmarred by the spectre of approaching death. We are writing a new family history, one where death comes naturally and unpredictably, where farewell letters are not written under duress, where the matriarch protects rather than preys upon her family. It is a harder story in some ways, lacking the strange comfort of knowing when death will come, but it is an honest story, and that makes all the difference. I think about the people who enabled Eleanor's crimes through their silence or willful blindness, the lawyers who handled the insurance payouts without questioning the pattern, the doctors who signed death certificates without demanding autopsies, the family members who suspected something but said nothing out of fear or respect for tradition. They were not murderers, but their compliance allowed murder to continue for decades. It makes me wonder how many other crimes hide behind social conventions and polite reluctance to ask uncomfortable questions. My mother has become an advocate for others dealing with elder abuse and suspicious family deaths. She speaks at conferences and support groups, sharing her story to help others recognize the signs of systematic poisoning and psychological manipulation. She tells them about the herbal drinks that made her drowsy, the pressure to write farewell letters, the beautiful room that was actually a killing floor. Her message is always the same. Trust your instincts, demand real medical care, and never accept death as inevitable just because someone in authority says it is. The financial aftermath of Eleanor's crimes took years to sort out. The millions she had accumulated through murder were eventually distributed among survivors and victims' families, though no amount of money could compensate for the lives lost. The family estate, built with blood money, was sold to developers who demolished the main house. I drove by recently and saw new homes being built where the transition room once stood, young families creating memories in a place that had been soaked in death. It felt like a cleansing, a way of ensuring that Eleanor's evil could not linger in the bones of the building. We held a real funeral for Eleanor's victims on what would have been my mother's 51st birthday. 23 candles for 23 lives cut short, each one representing someone who had trusted Eleanor and paid with their life. We read their real words, not the coerced farewell letters, but things they had written when they were truly themselves. We celebrated who they had been rather than mourning the curse that had never existed. It was the funeral they deserved, free from Eleanor's narrative and focused on truth rather than lies. The psychological impact of discovering that your entire worldview was based on a lie cannot be understated. Every family member had to grapple with the realization that we had been living in Eleanor's fiction, accepting death as inevitable when it was actually murder. Some struggled more than others with this adjustment. Cousins who had made major life decisions based on the assumption they would die at 50 had to recalibrate their entire existence. Relationships strained under the weight of survivors' guilt and the anger at years lost to fear. But we survived, individually and as a family. We learned to support each other through the trauma of uncovering truth, to forgive ourselves for believing lies, and to build new traditions based on honesty rather than deception. The Morrison family curse became the Morrison family miracle, the story of how one person's greed was defeated by another person's love. My mother lived because I refused to accept her death, and that refusal saved not just her life, but the lives of future family members who will never know the fear of an approaching 50th birthday. I keep a photo on my desk of my mother on her 60th birthday, laughing at something my daughter said, surrounded by family members who should not exist, according to Eleanor's plan. It reminds me daily that some things are worth fighting for, that accepting conventional wisdom without question can be deadly, and that love is stronger than even the most elaborate lies. The Morrison family curse died with Eleanor's conviction, but the Morrison family lives on, free from fear and writing our own story, one natural lifetime at a time.